Hello, I'm Jane Sanders, founder of the Sanders Institute. We at the Sanders Institute and our founding fellows believe that a vital democracy requires an informed electorate, civil discourse, and bold ideas. Our mission is to revitalize our democracy by engaging individuals, organizations, and the media in progressive solutions to racial, social, economic, and environmental justice. Today, I'm very pleased to bring in one of our remarkable founding fellows, Dr. Stephanie Kelton. Dr. Stephanie Kelton is a professor of public policy and economics at Stony Brook University. She has also been a chief economist at the U.S. Budget Committee and has been an economic advisor to the Bernie 2016 campaign. I'm so pleased to have you join us here today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Today, we're here to discuss an area of concern that many of us have experienced and many more Americans have. The crippling issue of student loan debt. Tell me, how did you get involved in this?
So it's interesting. There was a couple named Steve and Mary Swig, and they came to us a little over a year and a half ago. And they said to me, I'm interested in this problem of student loan debt. What do you know about it? And at the time, this hadn't been an area of my research focus. I didn't know a whole lot. But they became very interested in the problem because they had a daughter whose friend was really struggling with student loan debt. And when they found out the trouble that their daughter's friend was having, they started looking into the issue. And they couldn't believe what they found. They had both gone to UC Berkeley when they were much younger.
And
it was basically free. They paid essentially nothing. And they just didn't understand at the time how much things had changed over the years. And when they realized, they couldn't believe just how bad things had gotten. And so they asked us to take a look at this issue.
Well, you've proposed some pretty bold initiatives in terms of dealing with the issue.
Yeah.
Before we get to your solutions, though, let's put the issue in context. How does it affect the average American? Your report said that 44 million Americans are collectively $1.4 trillion in debt. How did we get here and why?
Yeah, so it's a huge number. Nearly $1.4 trillion is massive. That's now more debt than people hold in credit cards. So there's more outstanding student loan debt than there is credit card debt. And that's something that's new, and it's obviously, a huge number. And 44 million people, those are just the people who are directly affected today. Those are the people that are saddled with student loan debt that they're trying to pay off today. But of course, they have spouses who are also impacted, even if they themselves don't have student loan debt, and parents who are watching their own children struggle to pay back loans. And so, you hear 44 million, and that's a huge number in and of itself. But then if you extend out to friends and partners and parents and others, you're looking at, a threefold easily increase over that number. So how did we get here? It's a long story, right? College costs have been increasing, and they've been accelerating at a very rapid pace. States have withdrawn support over the years, pushing more and more of the burden of paying for college onto students themselves. The federal government has cut support. So there's just a lot of reasons why college costs have increased and the burden has been shifted onto the student themselves.
How does that compare with the median household income? I think I remember reading that census data said that between 1990 and 2004, it only went up 2%. How does that compare with the cost of higher
think
ed?
about that, right? That our incomes for the median person in the economy have risen very slowly, real incomes. Most people have not seen huge increases in their wages and salaries over the last many years, whereas college costs are just outstripping the cost of almost everything else in our economy. So if you go back, you mentioned 1990, but if you look at what's happened from 1980 until where we are today, college costs have increased 350%. People were paying around $2,000 in 1980 to go to college, and today it's closer to $10,000. So it's a huge increase, while wages haven't done anything like keep up with the rising cost of college.
Right. And you mentioned family involvement. I mean, I've heard from families who are trying to figure out how are they going to help their elderly parents at the same time they're helping their children. And then I've heard of other families where they say, you know, we can't afford to send our kids to college. We're still paying off our student debt. So it affects the choices that people make, and it affects their futures.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you write about that at all in your report?
We do speak to this in the report, and this is a truly tragic thing. These kinds of trade-offs facing parents today, as you say, you know, caring for their own parents, trying to figure out how to save for their own retirement, in many cases robbing their own retirement in order to try to help put their kids through college. And then the kids that come out saddled with student loan debt don't have a chance to start saving for their own retirement. So what you have is this vicious cycle where the kids today will be the elderly in the future who become dependent on the kids of the future, and it appears that unless we do something to arrest this now, this is a cycle that's going to perpetuate itself for decades to come.
What's the average amount of student debt for an individual?
Yeah, so a student graduating class of 2017 is coming out with an average of more than $37,000 in student loan debt. And of course, you know, that's an average. So for some students, for some it's less, but for some it's much, much more.
And how, do you know what the average length of time it takes to pay off that debt?
It varies, but there are some studies that have looked at students who come out of the University of Wisconsin system, and the average length of time is just under 20 years for a student who borrowed in order to get a bachelor's degree in Wisconsin.
Unbelievable.
2 decades of struggling to pay off a bachelor's degree.
Demographically, what groups are hardest hit? Have you looked at that? And is there a big distinction?
There are. Women bear a greater burden when it comes to student loan debt than men do. African Americans bear a far greater burden than whites or Asians when it comes to the carrying of and depending upon student loan debt. Young people are far more dependent. 63% of millennials have student loan debt, and that partly is a result, you know, around 10% of people 45 and older have student loan debt. But, you know, they're older, and in some cases they've had a chance to pay back loans, but in most cases they never had to become as dependent on student debt in the first place because college was so much cheaper when they went to school.
The research report is entitled Macroeconomic Effects on Student Debt Cancellation. So let's talk about the effect of the staggering amount of student debt on our country.
So that's really the question. We looked at this and we asked the question, it's a hypothetical. What would happen if we removed this wet blanket? And in fact, the question really is it a wet blanket? If you take off this wet blanket, if you said we're going to cancel $1.3 trillion in outstanding student loan debt, it's basically a clean slate for everybody who today has outstanding student loans. What would happen to the economy? That was the question that we were asking. So if, in fact, things improve, then it suggests that the existence of all of this debt is actually doing harm to the economy in a variety of ways. So if removing the student loan debt, if eliminating it, improves things like real GDP, unemployment rates, new business formation, you know, household formation, people get married because they can. They're not delaying these major life decisions because they feel like they just can't afford to get married and start a family because of student debt. So the paper is big, it's ambitious, and it's a macroeconomic, analysis. So it is looking at the whole economy and asking, you know, what would happen if we just wiped it all away? And the answer is that there are a number of benefits to the economy, including higher overall real growth in the economy, lower unemployment rates going forward, higher productivity rates. I mean, just the sorts of things that the ordinary person would think to tell you if you said, what do you think would happen if millions and millions of people who today sit down every month and write a check to pay off a portion of their student loan, what if instead of taking out the checkbook and writing that $350 check, they could keep that money and do something else with it? What do you think would happen? I think the average person would tell you probably spending on other things would go up. Maybe people would go out and, you know, have a meal in a restaurant. Maybe they would go out and, you know, do some shopping in a mall. Maybe they would go out and buy a new car. Maybe they would. So you can imagine the sort of stimulus to the economy as a result of freeing up that kind of disposable income for people.
So why is it allowed to continue? Is there anybody who benefits from this large amount of student debt?
Yeah, so at the aggregate level, the economy as a whole pays a huge price because of all of this debt. But there are people who benefit, and the prime beneficiaries are, of course, the student loan industry, those who are making the loans and collecting the interest and charging students fees and penalties and assessing, and that sort of thing builds up, and over time, they make billions of dollars off of borrowers.
Do they have much of a lobby down in?
They do, in fact.
Oh.
They do, in fact.
What a surprise.
They have, yeah. So their interests are well represented in Washington. This is not business that they're going to lose without a fight, and it's very lucrative for them.
We've seen some attempts, but they're pretty minimal, to stop the crippling burden. There have been loan forgiveness programs allowing students to combine and refinance at lower rates, but they're nibbling around the edges.
Yeah.
What you're proposing, cancellation of real student debt, will have quite an impact. Those are good programs. You know, I don't mean to discount them, but yours is a much more ambitious and comprehensive approach. How can that be done? How can we cancel all student debt?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that we do in the paper that takes up quite a lot of space because it's a big question. And you say, how do you actually go about getting the loans forgiven? You know, who takes the losses? How do you take them off of people's balance sheets? How do you tell people you no longer have to service this debt? You no longer have to write that check. How do you do that? And what we did was look at this from a couple of different ways. One is most of these loans are held by the federal government. They're held by the Department of Education, 90%. And the rest are privately held. And so it's pretty easy to imagine how you could go about forgiving the 90% that's held by the federal government. The federal government simply says, you don't need to pay these loans back. Okay, we're canceling them for you. Now we can talk about what are the implications on the government's budget as a result of that, because the government's not going to be collecting principal and interest on those loans. And so there's going to be some revenue loss to the federal government. But the privately held loans are different. Now this becomes a question, what do you want to do with these? A lot of these are in default already. A lot of students are having difficulty paying them back. They're in arrears and so forth. So, and some of them are fraudulent. And this goes to this sort of thing that you sort of hinted at a second ago. You know, you've had students win some victories with some of these for-profit universities and loans that they took that, you know, they've convinced the courts that this was fraudulent. I mean, this is fraud, and we shouldn't have to pay it back. And in some cases, the courts have sided with the students and said, you're right, you don't have to pay that back. So all this privately held debt, what we did in the paper was say, let's assume that we do the same thing we do for all of the debt that's held by the federal government. We're going to pay it all off. Okay, so everybody, in a sense, gets made whole. And that includes probably some very bad actors, which, if you think about it in one sense, it's kind of a deal for them because instead of having students default on their loans, they're going to get paid on all of these loans. The idea, though, would be that no more. Okay, no more going forward. So what this paper sort of presupposes is that if you're going to do something like this, if you're going to cancel $1.3 trillion in outstanding student loan debt, what you want to avoid is that immediately after you do this, people start taking on more debt. It starts accumulating again.
Yeah.
And so how do you prevent that from happening? And so what our paper assumes is that this is rolled in at a time when public colleges and universities are made tuition free. I think that, you know, our belief is that we're moving in that direction anyway. You see that in Tennessee, you see that in New York now, you see that happening in California, and I think this is a trend that's likely to continue. So, you know, you can't imagine doing something like this and getting, you know, a couple of generations of Americans out of this student debt trap and then immediately throwing millions more into the queue where they start accumulating debt.
Public colleges and universities become tuition free. Private colleges are still going to be charging. How does this program affect that and the problem that you've been talking about?
Yeah, so I guess in a sense it would work like it does in some countries where healthcare is made freely available to everyone. But there is an alternative for those who choose to go out and pay on their own.
Okay.
So I think private universities are going to be around, and for some people there will be perceptions of quality, or for whatever reason they're going to choose to go out of pocket and go to one of these private universities. So I don't think we're going to see them disappear as a result of this,
Right.
but you're going to have much more choice available for millions of people for whom college would never have been in the cards.
Now, one of the programs that the government has done in the past is do loan forgiveness programs for people who enter into community service, and then they forgive their loans over a 10-year period. You're talking about doing this all at once. What's the impact on the federal deficit, on inflation, on a number of the issues that,
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I can hear the naysayers. They will be
Sure.
out there in force saying this cannot possibly
Yeah,
happen.
absolutely. So that's one of the interesting things that this research shows. And what we did was we used two different macroeconomic models. I'm not going to get technical and I don't want to bore people, but I think it speaks to the robustness of the finding that we ran the simulations through two completely different models. And it serves as a check on your results. And so what we did was say, again, what would happen if we just forgave 1.3 trillion, okay? And we use this model and we use this model. And the models told us a very similar story. And the story is that the impact on the budget deficit would be rather trivial, around 0.5% of GDP. That's not too bad. So imagine their budget deficit is 3%, now it's 3.5%. That's a pretty good deal for wiping the debt away from 44 million Americans, right?
And stimulating the economy.
And stimulating the economy and adding to real GDP in a way that puts you better off than you would have been otherwise, reduces unemployment, so the employment rate, if you like, is higher than it would have been without the cancellation. The impact on inflation, now if you had a terrible inflation effect because all of a sudden people had all of this income and they spent it into the economy and the economy couldn't keep up and you caused an inflation problem, you say that was a really dumb thing to do. But both models tell us that the impact on inflation would be trivial. In fact, the Federal Reserve would probably tell you that they'd like to see a bigger impact on inflation because the Fed's been struggling to hit its own inflation target. In other words, the Fed wants more inflation in the economy than we currently have. And so a program like this, while it doesn't add much to inflation, about 1/3 of a percentage point, it would help the Fed, in a sense, achieve its own mandate. So on the stuff that you don't want to see happen, inflation and that sort of thing, you get a very minor impact. And on the stuff you do want to see happen, employment and output, you get a pretty significant impact.
Good. So we've talked about the individuals. We've talked about the country as a whole. What about our society, our culture? Do you think anything would change in terms of how people view schooling? Would more people go to college? What kind of an impact do you think it might have on our society as a whole?
I mean, I think about young kids who are looking at college as something that's further and further out of reach. They know that mom and dad aren't going to be able to send them to the school of their choice, maybe not even be able to afford the best local school in the state. And so in terms of the aspirations, in terms of what they're willing to work for and fight for when they're going through their grade school and junior high and high school years, to not believe that at the end of that process that college is something, if you want to go, that it's there for you, that it's attainable, and changing that in our culture and making it clear to young people that if you want to go on, if you don't want to stop at grade 12 and you want to go on, we are there for you because we know that the benefits of having you go to 4 more years of school don't just accrue to you. You're not the only person who's going to benefit from this process. Society as a whole is going to benefit. Education is a public good, and I think we've forgotten to think of education in those terms.
Yes, and I know we've worked together on free public tuition at public colleges and universities. So that is an important aspect to this. Has this approach worked elsewhere in the world? Are you familiar with any other countries that have done this?
I don't know of a country that has wiped the slate completely clean with respect to student loan debt. Most countries don't allow the problem to get to the point where we've allowed it to get. In fact, nobody else has the kind of problem that the US would be wrestling with respect to student loan debt. Other countries have done things like the income-based repayment programs and gotten much more ambitious there. The UK is just one example where you take students and you say, all right, you're going to pay back this loan, but only for a period of time and only really what we think you can afford. So linking it to their income, saying you're not going to pay back more than some percent of your income, and then after a certain number of years, we forgive the rest. So there are cases where loan forgiveness is part of the deal, but I don't know of a country that has gone all the way to say, starting tomorrow, everyone is liberated from their outstanding student loan debt. So it would be a first.
You say that 90% of the student loans are held by the federal government, and then you articulate the economic positives about doing it and the very minimal increase in federal deficits and inflation. It seems that the federal government should be all over this. Have you found any support within the administration or Congress or leaders, political leaders around the country
So
that were
I'm
interested?
not speaking directly yet with anyone about the proposal itself. This for us was just, again, like a research question, that we were interested in answering. The couple that funded the study, they're politically engaged and they are having these conversations. And from what I understand, they're seeing some traction here. And I can tell you that I've had emails from people who are running for Congress who aren't currently elected, but part of the platform that they're running on includes student debt forgiveness. And they are aware that I've been doing some research, so they're reaching out just by email to say, I thought I would let you know that this is part of my campaign platform, which is kind of a cool thing.
Yeah, excellent. So you're really having an impact. So what do you expect to be the biggest objections to this?
So I do think that the biggest one, at least from the wonky types, is going to be the price tag and the impact on the deficit. Even though the impact on the deficit is very small, for some people, there will be people who say we're not doing anything that adds a dime to the federal deficit or something like that. So that's probably going to be one of the main objections that people raise. But other people are just going to take it from a more personal level and say, hey, wait a minute. I just finished paying off my loans last year. You're kidding me, right? This timing is terrible. I paid my loans back. These guys shouldn't get a better deal than what I got, right? I mean, you're going to have people who say that. I worked hard. I paid it all down. It's not fair to forgive these. And so, what do you say to those people? You did get a rotten deal. That's what I would say. I mean, there was a period of time where public colleges and universities were free or essentially free. And we're moving in that direction again. So what you have are these people who were trapped in between. They're trapped between what was a good policy and what looks like it's going to be a good policy once again. And then you've just got this group of people who, through no fault of their own, got trapped by bad economic policy. Policymakers made a mistake. We should have been out ahead of this. We should have understood sooner that a high school degree isn't enough, that we needed to be moving in the direction that other countries were already moving or had already been, where they're making investments in their people that go beyond the 12th grade. And we didn't do that. And so we're righting a wrong. That's what we're doing with this policy. And it, in some sense, isn't fair to the people who took on student debt and paid it back, and they're out the income, and we can't wind the clock back and make things right for them, but what we can do is make things right for 44 million people today.
That's a good answer, Stephanie. When I've talked to you as you were working on it, you were very always giving credit to everybody else as well, everybody that's been working on it. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about some of your colleagues and your funders, if you would like.
That is so nice. Yes, this was a massive project. I mean, it took us almost a year and a half to bring this whole thing to fruition. So definitely a group effort. I worked with colleagues at my previous university, at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. I have a colleague there, Kathleen Rushlin, who was very, very important in this. She did great work. She had been at Demos before, and student loans and higher ed had been an area of expertise for her. So I went directly to her because I knew she would be invaluable on this project. Marshall Steinbaum, who had been at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth and was doing work on student loan debt there. And I went to Marshall because I knew he would bring great insights. And so Marshall Steinbaum and my colleague Scott Fulweiler, who is also at the University of Missouri in Kansas City. And Scott helped a lot with the macro modeling and answering some of these questions that are very technical in nature about how you actually go about dealing with moving these things all off of balance sheets. And so there's a big section in the paper that's very balance sheet wonky. That's Scott Fulweiler's contribution. And then we also had some help from a young graduate student named Joe Balgier, and he helped us with some research assistance. So thank you.
Dr. Kelton, you and your colleagues have broached this subject from a completely new perspective, and we hope very much that it will be debated and discussed in the halls of public policy, and that we have a lot of deliberations with this at the center, because I think what you've done is important not only to the 44 million people that are in debt, but the nation as a whole, and our culture, our respect for education, for people reaching their full potential. So thank you very much for everything you've done, and I look forward to working with you on this in the future.
Thank you, Jane. I do too.
I'm Jane Sanders. I'm so happy to be here with Dr. Stephanie Kelton on this important subject. Remember, a vital democracy requires an informed electorate, civil discourse, and bold ideas. We've certainly heard some of them here today, and we would like you to become involved with the Sanders Institute. Please stay engaged.